Hello and welcome to our lecture on ancient Egypt. This is week one of history of the ancient Near East in Greece. Within this portion of the lecture, we will be talking a little bit about the beginnings of Egypt. So if we look back at about 3600 BCE, we see that Egypt is basing its society upon life around the Nile. It's based upon raising crops and upon the domestication of animals. Shortly after 3600 BCE, Egyptian society began to grow and advance very rapidly towards a refined civilization. Now, maybe I should speak a little bit about what happened before this time. Before this time, there's very strong evidence that all of the desert to the west of Egypt was actually a large lake that had fairly thriving civilizations around it. And very slowly, the environment began to change, the prevailing winds began to change, and this landlocked lake slowly started to dry up. And as it dried up, people were forced to move. And they moved naturally towards the Nile. Lifeblood of civilization is water. So we always need to keep in mind, where's the water? Where is a place that people can sustain themselves? So they moved to the Nile, and that's where we see this growth of civilization start to happen around 3600 BCE. Shortly after 3600 BCE, we see this rise start to develop, and a very new and very distinctive type of pottery that was related to the southern portion of the Nile appeared. Within that pottery and other physical artifacts, there was an extensive use of copper. So we see copper mining start to come in. There was also the beginning to use the Mesopotamian process of sun-dried bricks. So there may have been some cross-pollination. Actually, we have good evidence that there was good cross-pollination of ideas between ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. This development of sun-dried bricks was the foundational architectural principle within the earliest times within ancient Egypt. And they developed this fairly well. There was the development of arches and recessed walls, and all of this became very popular around 36 BCE. Now, Egypt was divided into what was known as Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. We need to be mindful that this is different from how we use maps today. The idea of Upper Egypt was that its elevation is higher. It is farther upstream from the Nile, and therefore it's called Upper Egypt. As you flow down towards the ocean, then you have Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt was the northern part of the Nile. So Lower Egypt was the northernmost part of Egypt that ran through into the delta at the end of the Nile and flowed out into the Mediterranean Sea. Upper Egypt was a strip of land that extended all the way down into Nubia and then flowed down from there. Now, this is important because Upper Egypt typically has the power. So the southern part of Egypt is typically where the power base is. This is also where the highest culture develops. And what we see fairly early on is that there was warfare between Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt, remember, being the area that typically has the most power. Now, around 3100 BCE, we see the reign of King Narmer. King Narmer was ruling Upper Egypt, and he began to wage war against the people in the Delta, that northern part of the Nile. And we get some evidence of this from the Narmer palette, also known as the Great Chronopolis. This Narmer palette is significant because it dates from around 3100 BCE, and it contains some of our earliest evidence of hieroglyphic inscriptions. Now, within this Narmer palette, we see a picture of Narmer wearing a double crown. And this is significant because the double crown is composed of the lotus flower, representing Upper Egypt, and the papyrus reed, representing Lower Egypt. And this double crown is significant of the unification of Egypt. So here we see Egypt being unified. There is, over the next 1,000, 2,000 years, still some regional disparities that go on between these areas, but here is the first time that we see this use of the double crown. And this use of the double crown then becomes the standard for the imagery of kings and pharaohs to follow. Now, within Egyptian mythology, this unification of Egypt is portrayed as the falcon god, which is called Horus, and identified and Horus is identified with Lower Egypt, and Horus was conquered and subdued by the god Set, who's identified with Upper Egypt. Now, as we move down now into a time known as the Old Kingdom, ancient Egyptian history, we have this period in the third millennium. So around 3680 BCE through to about 2180 BCE. We have this age that is known as the Age of the Pyramids, or the Age of the Pyramid Builders. And this includes the Great Fourth Dynasty with King Snefru, where he perfected the art of building pyramids, with the Great Pyramids of Giza. Now, the pyramids of Giza are constructed under the kings of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. And it's this that gives us that symbol within history of the first great continuous civilization to come down from the eons. So the first three so-called kingdom periods, followed by so this Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, formed the first three so-called kingdoms, and that's followed then by the Middle Kingdom and what we call the New Kingdom. Now we need to kind of be mindful that in this time, the power was typically placed in the upper part of Egypt known as Memphis. Now the first pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, so sometime between 2691 and 2625 BCE of the Third Dynasty, he ordered the construction of a pyramid. Now this pyramid was a step pyramid. So Pharaoh Dozier, also known as Zoser, commanded this construction of the pyramid in Memphis. Now it's one of the important people in this reign of Zoser was his vizier, his royal vizier by the name of Imhotep. Imhotep was typically your chief architect, the one that was in charge of public works, and is likely the one that was the administrative genius behind the development of this pyramid. Now it's in this era that we see the pharaohs beginning to be worshipped as God. They believed that the pharaoh was responsible for the annual flooding of the Nile, and that was necessary for the crops. And so within this agricultural society, the Egyptians viewed nature as working in cycles. And it was the role of the pharaoh, who was a god on earth, to ensure that these cycles continue, that there be stability within these cycles. And so the perception was within the people that the pharaoh is the one that they are dependent upon for their livelihood. Now, when we look at the pyramids that we think about today, ever since they were built 4,500 years ago on the desert beside present-day Cairo, the pyramids of Giza have stirred great emotions. The most impressive and the largest of these were built by Pharaoh Khufu around 2600 BCE. The greatest of these, known as the Great Pyramid, it was, until modern times, the world's largest building, covering an area of 7 city blocks and weighing 6.5 million tons. The construction of Khufu's pyramid was one of the most extraordinary feats of engineering to have ever occurred. The craftsmanship and the cooperative effort is astounding. In less than 30 years, the workers had to raise over 2 million blocks to a height of over 40 stories. So this is at a rate, and think about this, a rate of 1 block every 3 minutes for 30 years. That's an amazing accomplishment. And especially for an ancient people with the simplest of technologies. These ancient builders of the pyramids, they took great care, and they took great care because these were the sacred tombs of the pharaohs. And they were designed to ensure their immortality. So they were designed to last forever. To the ancient Egyptians, death was seen as just the beginning of a journey to another life, an afterlife that would last forever if things were properly organized at departure. First, the corpse had to be preserved by mummification, and then the body had to be protected from the elements and intruders by a burial chamber. Now, the location here is also significant because this is part of the entire ancient worldview. These great pyramids of Giza are located on the west side of the Nile. Now, if we think in terms of ancient cosmology, the sun is born every morning. It's born in the east. So it rises in the east. So life comes from the east. So the east side of the Nile was seen as the place of life. And then the sun died every day in the west. So the west is seen as the place of the dead. And so would they place these pyramids as far west as they can on the west side of the Nile. So right off into the edge of the desert. And that's all very significant. Now, when they prepared the bodies, the first thing that they would do is, with the corpse is they would preserve it by mummification. And then the body had to be protected. These burial chambers called mastabas, these tombs, then there was tombs that surrounded the pyramid as well. And these mastabas were literally considered houses for the dead. They contained images of their owners, of servants, and they contained everything that the owner would need for the afterlife. And there was a whole subdivisions of these mastabas on the Giza plateau. The Egyptians believed that their kings became gods at death, and then they could ensure that in this afterlife there was an afterlife for everybody. So the pharaohs got the biggest tombs, the great stone mountains that would last into eternity. And this then becomes this age of giant pyramids. So in the beginning, it all begins with the pyramid of Djoser, also known as Zoser, which is really the world's first skyscraper in stone, the first pyramid in Egypt. It's a stepped pyramid, and some think it's kind of a symbol of a ladder of the king's soul to ascend to the heaven. And this pyramid of Djoser then begins this process of building these great pyramids. The universal characteristic of ancient Egyptian pyramids was the precision by which the base was laid out. And the four sides were oriented to face true north, true south, true east, true west. And so we know that they likely used the sun or a set of stars to establish the north-south line. And the next step then was to lay out the stone base and with precise right angles. Now, the Old Kingdom and its royal power reached its peak under the 4th dynasty, so around 2613 to 2494, somewhere in there, BCE, which began with Snefru at 2613. Now, after Djoser, Pharaoh Snefru was the next great pyramid builder. Snefru commissioned the building of not one, but 3 pyramids. The first, called the Median Pyramid, named for its, and Medium is the location within Egypt. Snefru abandoned it, and after the outside casing started to collapse. So they're trying to figure out how to build these pyramids. Now, the Medium Pyramid was the first pyramid to have a above ground burial chamber. So this is so massive that you can have an above ground burial chamber and no one's going to raid it. Now, this first pyramid of Snefru was the largest building at its time, using more stones. Now, he also built what was called the bent pyramid, and this one collapses. It went up at a certain angle, and then they realized that it wasn't stable, the foundation wasn't good enough, and so they changed the angle. So it goes up, and you see 2 very distinct angles with the bent pyramid. And then finally, the red pyramid. But the full development of the pyramid style of buildings doesn't reach its real traditional peak until we have the Great Pyramids of Giza. Now, Snefru was succeeded by his son Khufu. Khufu lived reigned between 2589 BCE and 2566 BCE. And Khufu is the one that built the Great Pyramid of Giza. Now, they had worked out the problems with building pyramids in his father's lifetime, and so Khufu was able to build what we know as the pyramids that we envision now. Now, after Khufu's death, his son, Jedfra, and Khafre, they began to quarrel, and Khafre built the second pyramid. And in traditional thinking, at least, Khafre also built the Sphinx in Giza. So this would have been in the 2500s BCE. And that is the end of our lecture for the beginnings of ancient Egypt. I'll see you guys next week.